Brian, now we're about to hear about a distinguished New Zealander from a man who's somewhat of a distinguished New Zealander himself. Dr. Adam Claasen is a senior lecturer in history at Massey University. In 2006, he was the Fulbright visiting lecturer in New Zealand Studies at Georgetown University, that's in Washington, DC. And in 2009, he received the Vice Chancellor's Award for Sustained Excellence in Teaching. Currently, I hope this is current, he teaches Second World War and American 20th century history. He also publishes on the role of air power, military intelligence and combined operations in the First and Second World Wars. His work includes Hitler's Northern War, the Luftwaffe's ill-fated campaign 1940 to 1945, Dogfight, the Battle of Britain, and Fearless, the extraordinary untold story of New Zealand's Great War airmen. Currently, Adam's engaged in a long-term project exploring the role of New Zealanders as pilots, observers and ground crew in the Great War across the Royal Flying Corps, the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Air Force, 1914 to 1918. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Adam Claasen.
Well, it's my honour and privilege to talk to you today about Sir Keith Park. My main thesis and argument is simply this, that Park was New Zealand's foremost military commander. To put it bluntly, no single New Zealander in uniform had more of an impact on the course of the Second World War and the 20th century than Keith Park. I'll say that again because this is the main thesis I'm going to present. That no single New Zealander in uniform had more of an impact on the course of the 20th century and the Second World War than Keith Park. In the time that I have today, I have divided our presentation up into two parts. The first is looking at his formative years and career as an airman in the Great War. And then in part two, we're going to turn to his role in the most important aerial campaign in the history of warfare, the Battle of Britain. Let's start off with Keith Park in the First World War. Well, in the year of our Lord, 1916, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was 24 months into his attempt to gain German hegemony over continental Europe. It was on the 21st of October of that year, in the mud and the blood of the Somme, that Keith Park's aviation career was birthed in extreme violence. On that day in northwestern France, a German artillery shell was fired, travelling at more than 1 mile per second and containing enough explosives to kill a score of men. It sailed above the grey uniformed German soldiers, the moonscape of no man's land, the upturned heads of Tommy soldiers in their trenches, and landed amongst the artillery behind the British lines. It struck the earth beneath a horse and its rider, moving artillery pieces around the battlefield. The horse was destroyed, the rider badly injured. That man was Keith Park. Within days, Park was convalescing in England. Although he was hobbled with a chest wound and racked by nightmares, he later considered the terrifying event a fortuitous turning point in his life. Park was now no longer deemed fit for service with the artillery. He was discharged, having served at Gallipoli and, of course, more latterly on the Somme. In spite of the war being done with Park, Park was clearly not done with the Great War. And he took this opportunity for entry into the newest and one of the most dangerous military endeavours of that time, military warfare in the air, military aviation. And Park didn't waste his time. He entered a flying school in England and was found to be a natural. Within 2 hours of dual instruction, he was sent up in an aircraft like this. This is a Morris Farman. It can travel some 70 miles per hour and ascend to about 4,000 feet. His training during this period was remarkably trouble-free, which of course was a rarity. Many men were killed under instruction in the Great War. It's estimated that between a quarter and a third of all airmen who would lose their lives between 1914 and 1918 in the Royal Flying Corps and the RAF and the Royal Naval Air Service lost their lives on the training fields of England. A quarter to a third. After retaining his wings, Park went on to serve 15 months of air warfare in a service that had a 1 in 4 loss rate. A 1 in 4 loss rate. He did this in part due to his own resourcefulness as an airman, but also due to a dollop of good luck, which of course every airman in the First World War desperately needed. The first piece of luck he had was this, is that although at the end of his training he'd accumulated 35 flying hours, this would be substantially increased by a posting before going to the Western Front as a flying instructor. The result of this was that when Park would finally arrive in France, he would have 135 flying hours under his belt and lodged in his logbook. The average for an airman in 1917 was less than 40 hours. So he had a lot of experience that others did not have. The second thing that he was blessed with at this time was good timing and a fantastic machine for him to engage in aerial warfare in. Earlier that year, during 1917's bloody April, the Royal Flying Corps was hammered by superior German aeroplanes, losing over 250 machines to barely 70 German machines. Park missed this slaughter when posted to 48 Squadron on the 7th of July 1917, where he took the reins of one of the new and widely respected aircraft that would turn the tables on the Germans. This is Park standing in front of a Bristol F-2 fighter. It's part of a trio of machines that would give the Allies and the British the ascendancy on the Western Front in 1917 through to the early part of 1918, the other, of course, being the Sopwith Camel and the Royal Aircraft Factory SE-5A. Park's machine, though, was the Bristol F-2 fighter. It was a two-seater biplane that served as a fighter and reconnaissance aircraft. It was agile. It was versatile. The Rolls-Royce Falcon engine gave it a maximum speed of 123 miles per hour and lifted its crew to a service ceiling of 18,000 feet. It was with this machine that Park and his observers would accumulate 20 victories in aerial combat. It would mean that he remained the highest scoring member of 48 Squadron even right up until November of 1918 and the end of the war. Park's most successful day was 17 August 1917, when he had 4 victories in a single day, along with his observer, Englishman Arthur Noss. All four enemy machines were the well-regarded Albatross D3s. For his efforts, and Noss for his efforts, they were awarded a military cross for their action. It was to be the first of 2 for Park. But Park did not remain just as an airman or pilot. His leadership qualities and abilities were well appreciated by his superiors. And in 1918, he was given command of 48 Squadron. You can see the assembled crew of 48 Squadron there. Quite a large photo, because remember it includes not only the pilots but the observers. So on a Camel Squadron, it's a much smaller photograph. But with these Bristol fighter squadrons, you're doubling the air crew. And Park is seated there next to the man who's got the dog just down at his feet. And it was as a commander of the squadron that he probably came under his sternest test on the 24th of August 1918, when German bombers raided his airfield at Bertongla. You can see Bertongla airfield in the bottom left-hand corner and the types of bombers that the Germans used. The photo on the right is a picture of Park, pipe in mouth. What would he do with a non-vaping policy, ladies and gentlemen? But just looking the part, just looking like Major Park. It was 5 Gotha heavy bombers under a full moon that attacked the 3 hangars on 24th of August. One of the flanking hangars was home to 6 fully fueled and armed Bristols. It went up in flames, a huge cacophony of noise, sight, sound, and smells. The second hangar was hit, Between these was Park's third hangar. This hangar Park has set aside for entertainment, and that very evening, his crew members and members of other neighbouring squadrons had come for a variety concert. And as the shells started to fall, men started to panic, running from this hangar. Some diving towards trenches, others roaming around purposelessly in a state of shock. Park himself, the commander of the squadron, the man who was running things, was caught up in the stampede. And this is what he had to say about that moment. He said, "I started to run away, panic with the crowd. Everybody panicked to start with. It was just whoosh, and I started to run. I realized it was my unit that I was running away from. So I turned around, went back and gathered a few men to pull the burning machines out of the hangar. Cut up and bleeding profusely, he carried several men from the blazing buildings. As one flight commander commented afterwards, Park behaved magnificently. Remarkably, he was able to get his squadron, devastated squadron, back into full operations within weeks." The men who served with Park in the First World War recall an officer who was pleasant but not overly outgoing. Keith Park could never be said to be perhaps the life of the party or extremely gregarious. It just wasn't his nature. Park could also be strict, but this was tempered by his even-handed approach to his airmen and supporting ground crew, and a deep concern for the welfare of his personnel. Long before Park became Air Vice Marshal Park and the Defender of London and the Knight of Malta, he was an airman in the Royal Flying Corps and RAF of the Great War. It was here that he was New Zealand's second highest scoring airman and one of only a dozen New Zealanders to command a squadron. And the leadership qualities he demonstrated here would hold him in good stead 2 decades later. What might we say about the interwar years? What did he fill his time with? Just a brief synopsis of his career between the First and the Second World War. Significantly, he got a posting to Egypt in 1923, in which he was struck with illness, nearly pushing him out of his military career. By 1926, his health had returned, and he took up a position at the Air Defence of Britain Staff at Uxbridge. He was then given command of 111 Squadron. He became a wing commander in 1929, a station commander at North Holt in 1931. In 1932, he was at Oxford University Air Squadron's chief instructor. He was made a group captain in 1935. He was 43 years old. Then, in that same year, Park became an air attaché in South America to exotic locales in Argentina and Brazil. In 1937, he completed a course at the Imperial Defence College. He was made an Air Commodore in 1938, and then significantly, in that same year, in the month of July, Park began working with Hugh Dowding in preparations for a possible war with Germany. He would become an Air Vice Marshal on the 4th of March, 1940, after the war had begun. And this brings me to the second part of this presentation, which is really Park in the Second World War. In the year 1940, Adolf Hitler turned his eyes upon Britain's Green Isles. Behind him lay a devastated and subjugated Poland, a defeated Norway and Denmark, an overrun Low Countries, and a defeated great power, France, brought to its knees and completely subjugated. You will recall that famous photograph of Hitler walking beneath the Eiffel Tower in Paris. And yet, for Adolf Hitler, his great prize yet remained unclaimed. Lebensraum, or living space in the East. The conquest and annexation of vast swathes of Bolshevistic Russia, the creation of a very large Grossdeutschland stretching all the way from the North Sea to the Ural Mountains. And to avoid fighting on 2 fronts to achieve this goal, and to get a free hand in the East, Hitler sought to bring Britain to the negotiating table. In this attempt, of course, he was rebuffed by none other than the pugnacious Winston Churchill. And being rebuffed meant that war maps were unfurled and plans were drafted in Berlin for the invasion of the United Kingdom, Operation Sea Lion. The success of such an endeavour was dependent first upon the defeat of the Royal Air Force, the RAF, attaining what military strategists called aerial superiority in the crossing of the Channel and above the beaches of southern England, which was the essential prerequisite for the invasion. To this end, the head of the Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force, Hermann Göring, assembled two vast air fleets. You can see them on the map here in France and Belgium, Luftflotte 2 und 3. The objective of these men and machines was to defeat the RAF. The principal force that would be opposing all of this was RAF's Fighter Command under the leadership of Hugh Stuffy Dowding, and a defensive system of radar stations, observers, airfields, sector stations, and fighter aircraft. Organisationally and geographically, the United Kingdom, as you can see it on this map, was segmented into a series of fighter groups, the most important of which was 11 Group, down in southeast England, home to the heart of the British Empire, its capital, London, and of course the beaches in South England where the invasion was supposed to take place. The man in charge of 11 Group was none other than the 48-year-old Thames-born New Zealander Keith Park. The 4-month Battle of Britain would begin on the 10th of July, 1940. The German armada was impressive, some 2,600 aircraft, of which 700 odd were the single-seat Messerschmitt Bf-109s, which you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of this picture, and a collection of bombers and dive bombers, and a 2-engine Zerstörer, which is the Messerschmitt Bf-110 at the top left-hand corner, some 2,600 aircraft. Opposing this would be some 600 to 700 Hurricanes and Spitfires of Fighter Command, of which about 200 or so were with Park and 11 Group, though numbers would change, of course, over time. Time does not allow us the luxury of looking at Park's career across the entire 4 months. At university, I spend a whole 50 minutes just on the Battle of Britain. So we, unfortunately, alas, have not sufficient time to do that. But I want to cover just a couple of things. And I thought the first of them would be this. What were the leadership qualities that Park embodied that made him so successful in the eventual victory of Fighter Command? And secondly, I thought we would look at one day during the Battle of Britain and focus our attention and minds on his efforts and what transpired at that moment. Well, firstly, what could we say about Park as a leader? Well, I think he was no armchair general sitting far behind the front lines in a chateau. During the Battle of Britain, Park frequently flew his personalised Hurricane to 11 Group's bases to get an accurate appraisal of the fighting. He was no armchair general. Over the entire period of the Battle of Britain, Park flew on no fewer than 31 days, calling into 11 Group's airfields on at least 59 occasions. And Park had a deft touch with his subordinates. As James Hayter from New Zealand, a pilot who flew in the Battle of Britain, simply stated, Park listened to blokes that were actually doing the job. Park listened to the blokes that were actually doing the job. Flying constantly between bases in his Hurricane, clothed in white overalls, the tall New Zealander was keen to glean information from the frontline pilots as they returned from their dogfights over England. Morris Kinder, a Hurricane pilot from here in Auckland, said this about Park. He saw the pilots after patrols. When they had seen their best friends go down in flames, he would have a cigarette and a drink with them. And he was, in return, looked upon as one of the boys. His flying logbook We don't have his logbook from the First World War, alas, but we do have his from the Second World War, and it's held down at the Air Force Museum in Wigram in Christchurch. And if you look at his logbook, you can see his movements across the Battle of Britain. It's testament to his hands-on leadership and determination to command from the front. So I think that's an important aspect of the way Park was made. The second is he was a holistic manager of men who understood that the success of his force was as dependent on the ground crew as it was the pilots. Airmen who were dismissive of mechanics and armourers were soon removed from frontline duties. He had very little patience for some of the Brill Cream boys that looked down upon the ground crew. And thirdly, Park was punctual in dealing with matters that were problems. He didn't let things fester. An example of this came at the height of the Battle of Britain when 257 Squadron lost both flight commanders. And the squadron commander was showing what is uncharitably known as a lack of moral fibre, LMF. On the very first sortie with the new flight commanders at 20,000 feet, they spotted intruders above Maidstone. The CO refused to order an attack. The new flight commanders ignored this and ploughed into the enemy. After this occurring on a couple more occasions, the flight commanders got some Dutch courage and phoned up Park at RAF Uxbridge, and in short order, the commanding officer was relieved of his duties. And finally, what made Park so successful was that he understood the enemy and had the right strategy for the situation at hand. Ladies and gentlemen, you can have all those other characteristics, but without this one, it doesn't matter. Park didn't believe that it was important to inflict large losses on the Luftwaffe. And you're thinking, that seems unusual, Adam, in a time of war. But let's look at his rationale. He did not believe it important to inflict large losses on the Luftwaffe. Rather, he wanted to safeguard his resources. In other words, he wouldn't give the Germans what they wanted, the opportunity to destroy fighter command. He believed that as long as his force remained intact, the Luftwaffe could not win. Because of this, he sent up small numbers of fighters to intercept each raids, avoiding decisive damage to his own forces. The idea was that the Luftwaffe would realize they were getting nowhere, and eventually Herr Hitler would be forced to give up. Well, Park's test then, looking at this one day that I want to turn to now, his biggest test came arguably on the 15th of September 1940 when Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrived at Keith Park's headquarters at RAF Uxbridge, the nerve centre of 11 Group's efforts against the onslaught of the German Luftwaffe. Now, in the centre here, you can see the plotting table. And on that plotting table are discs, and those discs are moved to and fro in accordance with the ebb and flow of the battle. It indicates the position of RAF forces and German forces. You can see a raised area behind that, then above that a mezzanine floor area, what we might call the command module. And it was in one of these two areas that Churchill was standing with Park. But what cannot be seen from this photograph is the wall that they looked at on the other side of the room. By the way, you can go to the Battle of Britain bunker today. It's a 30-minute drive from Heathrow Airport. I would thoroughly recommend it. It's one of those great places you can go to. And if you go in there, you go down a whole series of stairs. The gate next to Park's house is still there, painted green. The house is no longer there, but you can get your photograph taken at the gate that he would go through every day as he went down into the bunker. Go down the stairs, it gets colder and colder as you get down to the bowels of the earth, and you enter this plotting room, and you can walk up into this mezzanine area. But one of the striking features of this room is the wall opposite. You can see here on this wall above the map on the plotting table of southeast England, you can see the sector stations, Hornchurch, Biggin Hill, etc. But above this are the squadrons, 46 Squadron, 25, 249, and then at Hornchurch's squadrons. And you'll notice that some lights are on, and those lights indicate the status of these formations, whether they are refueling, whether they are ready to scramble, whether they are in the air, or whether they have engaged the enemy already. It was a marvelous system for monitoring the progress of the battle itself. And it was this that Churchill described later. And this is what he had to say on this day of 15 September 1940 as he stood looking at the plotting table and this great wall in front of him. Presently, the red bulbs showed that the majority of our squadrons were engaged. A subdued hum arose from the floor where the busy plotters pushed their discs to and fro in accordance with a swiftly changing situation. The Air Marshal himself, Park, walked up and down behind, watching with a vigilant eye every move in the game, supervising his junior executive and only occasionally intervening with some decisive order, usually to reinforce a threatened area. In a little while, all our squadrons were fighting, and some had already begun to return for fuel. All were in the air. The lower line of bulbs was out, and there was not one squadron left in reserve. A grave and frowning Churchill, asked Park, "What other reserves have we got?" To which the tall, lean New Zealander calmly replied, "None." In his magisterial history, multi-volume history of the Second World War, Churchill reflected on his thoughts at that very moment as he saw firsthand the closeness of the battle as it unfolded on 15 September. And this is what he wrote: "The odds were great, our margins small, the stakes infinite." I want you to remember that phrase, the stakes infinite. In Churchill's mind, the odds were great, our margins small, the stakes infinite. 15 September, now known as Battle of Britain Day, saw an all-out assault on London in a series of raids beginning at midday and ending at dusk. Close to 1,500 aircraft took part in the battles. Howard Hill of Blenheim, New Zealand, describes the action from the cockpit of his Spitfire. I'm going to read to you from an after-action combat report written by a New Zealander who was flying on that day. He said, "I attacked a Dornier 17 over Hornchurch. I made 3 beam attacks firing up to 20 yards range. Some of the crew bailed out and the aircraft was smoking so badly I broke off my attack. Alone, 15 minutes later, I spotted a Heinkel 111 at 10,000 feet and attacked it from behind and above. It began to smoke and went down in a dive, crashing on the edge of a wood south of the river. Afterwards, I attacked another Heinkel, which after 2 beam attacks lowered its undercarriage in surrender and landed in Maidstone. Climbing again, I met another Heinkel coming out of a cloud. After 2 beam and 1 stern attack, it unfortunately crashed into a row of houses at Rochester. This was the afternoon raid of over 500 enemy aircraft, 400 of which were the Messerschmitt Bf-109 single-seat fighters. When 15 September had concluded, the Germans had lost 56 aircraft. Keith Park, 26, with only 13 men killed. Soon thereafter, Churchill, with the events at Uxbridge fresh in his mind, addressed Parliament with these words: "Sunday's action was the most brilliant and fruitful of any fought up to that date by the fighters of the Royal Air Force. We may await the decision of this long air battle with sober but increasing confidence. It would be just 1 month later that Hitler would be forced to cancel his plans for an invasion of Britain, and the campaign was won." What then of an assessment of Park's achievements? What have historians, military strategists, and even his peers said about what he did during the Battle of Britain? Well, historians and military strategists overwhelmingly agree with the New Zealander's assessment of the campaign and his deployment of men and material. To give you a good example from Stephen Bungay, perhaps the best historian of the Battle of Britain, he had this to say: Park's performance was extraordinary. Throughout the long months of strain, Park hardly put a foot wrong, making all the major tactical decisions, attending to relevant details, visiting pilots and airfields himself, and fighting an internal political battle. The well-regarded Second World War ace, Johnny Johnson, succinctly noted about Park that he was, quote, the only man who could have lost the war in a day or even an afternoon. In a day, lost the war. And of course, Lord Tedder, Marshal of the Royal Air Force, said this about Park: if any man won the Battle of Britain, he did. I do not believe it is realised how much that one man, with his leadership, his calm judgment and skill, did to save not only his country, but the world. Think about the phrases that we've heard. Churchill said the stakes were infinite. Johnny Johnson said that it could have been the losing of the war. And Lord Tedder said it was about saving the world. These are extremely large claims, ladies and gentlemen. Why would these individuals be saying this? Well, I think it's because the Battle of Britain was, as George Orwell said in a radio broadcast in 1942, that the Battle of Britain was as important as the Battle of Trafalgar. Just as Admiral Lord Nelson's defeat of Napoleon's forces had repelled the French-Spanish Armada from England's shores, so had the men of Hugh Dowding's fighter command thwarted Hitler's malignant plans for Western Europe. And that meant that one light of democracy and decency had not been extinguished. And although it took another 5 years to win the war, it was certain that Britain could not be conquered in one blow, said Orwell. And remember, since the outbreak of the war, Poland had been destroyed and subjugated, Denmark and Norway overrun, the Low Countries defeated, and of course, France brought to its knees. What did the Battle of Britain do first, ladies and gentlemen? It showed that Hitler could be checked. He could be stopped. And of course, with the defeat of Hitler in the Battle of Britain, it meant that the very thing that he had so assiduously attempted to avoid, a two-front war, was right upon him. The action of July and October of 1940 and its attendant British resistance would go on in the years that followed to siphon off German resources on a massive scale. Think about the construction and manning of the Atlantic Wall, all needed because the Battle of Britain had been won. The laying siege to Albion via the Battle of the Atlantic, U-boats, surface vessels, all deployed, men and equipment in that theatre. Or think about the Mediterranean, where they had to contest British dominance, and then finally in defending the cities of the Third Reich against the mass bombing raids of the Allied bombers. Cumulatively, all these theatres sapped Germany of men and material that might well have been better employed on the Eastern Front, where the war would be ultimately decided. And of course, Park's effort and those of the airmen and Hugh Dowding, their victory made D-Day possible. Although the entry of the United States into the war was dependent on events in the Pacific, the continued resistance of Britain meant that Washington was able to pursue a Europe-first policy, something that would have been impossible if Britain had not remained in the war. Consequently, the British Isles was to become a vast staging post for the Allied build-up, and that culminated in the Normandy landings. And the 1944 assault on the Atlantic Wall gave the Allies the foothold they needed to liberate France, push into Germany, and finally join up with the Red Army advancing from the east. Without D-Day, the Soviets may well have won the Second World War alone, something that would have been dire. The consequences of a communist-dominated Europe would have been something very unpleasant for Western Europe. I would argue that the jackboots of Nazism would merely have been replaced with the hobnail boots of Stalinist communism, with its attendant economic collectivism, secret police, and political repression. In other words, the Battle of Britain led to the securing of democracy in Western Europe in the post-war decades. To put it bluntly, as we started this evening, no single New Zealander in uniform had more of an impact on the course of the Second World War and of the 20th century than Thames's own son and New Zealander, Keith Park. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.